Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today in episode 2 we're moving forward with building the 1972 Alfa Romeo GT 2000s motor. It's a 2-liter Spica motor. Episode 1 you saw that we kind of took it apart, took apart the motor, disassembled it, found a couple of things that were issues that we have since fixed. Number one, this is just more of a recap from last episode. Number one, the cylinder number 1 was seized, so we had to take a hammer at it and really work at it to get it freed up so we can get all the pistons out, the crank out, liners and all that. So we did that, and then as I was cleaning all the parts, the connecting rods, I noticed on cylinder, I think it was number 4, that the, let me show you this, this is a new rod here, but the wrist pin bushing or bearing, whatever you want to call it, it was freely spinning, and that's a pressed on part. So we would have to have sent the rods off and had them find a larger bushing or bearing or whatever you want to call it, but the interior of it would have to be the same for the wrist pin. So that was would have been my very last resort to do that. I really did not want to do that. And then of course I ran across Max Peating rods here, and these are so much more stronger than what the OEM rods are or were. And also this will be nice for our build that we'll talk about what we're putting in this motor. But these were a whole lot better. They were $425, $435 for the set. Some people have told me that about a year ago they were in the threes, like $350 or something like that for 4 of them. So we went ahead and got 4 new ones that we're going to be putting in. They're going to be lighter, more stronger, so it's going to allow us to freely move up in the RPMs a lot higher than what the stock motor would have done. The motor kit, or the engine rebuild kit, head and block, so the whole thing came from Paul Spurl Motorsports. We did the 85 millimeter fast, I think it's the fast road version of his kit, so it wasn't the race kit. It's a little bit lower than that. So we're doing 11-to-1 compression. We've got, and I'll show you some of these, we've got the I think they're called JE pistons, and I've got all the rods, or I'm sorry, all the rings are in and ready to go. So we just kind of collapse them down and put them in the cylinders. So we got that. We've got, let's see, high flow oil pump, which Paul says is much better than what you can go buy on the in the other sites that are well known to buy Alpha parts, and of course new timing chains and all that. I'll show you that here in a second. Now, we did talk about a twist to this motor. Let's talk a little bit about this. Now, in no way is this meant to trigger anybody. In no way is this meant to say that I know more than somebody else knows, because a lot of people that watch this channel, they'll forget more stuff on these Alphas than I'll ever learn in my lifetime. And I've spoken to quite a few Alpha people. I'm talking about guys that have been in this field for 30+ years, and just started to gain some opinions on what I should do. So, all right, so here's a twist. Again, this is not triggering. You may want to stop it and fast forward a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to not reinstall the Spica system. I would have to send the Spica off, the system off itself, to get it rebuilt, and that's going to be very expensive, more so than what I want to do. So the first step we're going to do, this will be in episode 3, we'll have the motor on the engine stand and we're going to fire her up, so you'll be able to hear her running, and hopefully we don't make big fireballs or clankety clank noises. But we're going to start those up on 2 40 DSOE Webers right here. So these Webers are only going to be around to get it started, to kind of run her in, burn her in, and then we're going to move on to the twist. So the twist will be, we're going to fabricate our own fuel injection system from scratch. I've got the computers, the ITBs, We've got a few other parts we've got to order. This is going to be probably episode 4. Episode 5 is when we're going to start putting this thing together. It's going to be really cool. You're going to be able to, I am going to be able to go off at O'Reilly's or an AutoZone or anywhere like that and pick up parts if anything ever breaks. So hopefully they won't. So we're going to be using off-the-shelf parts for the most part to make this motor run on a modern day sequential fuel injection system. And we'll go over that more. Now, I did talk a little bit about Svelto performance systems in some other posts and things I've been making on social media channels. And we're forming, my business partner and I, we're forming a company called Svelto Performance Systems. And what that's going to do is you're going to watch this kit be built, this fuel injection system be built. And when this fuel injection system gets built and you see it running, we're going to create a kit. And within that kit, you're going to be able to buy and you're going to be able to install it right on, right at on your garage floor. The engine or the motor or car does not have to be up on a lift. You're going to be able to install it to convert Spica, and then our next one will be converting Webers to it as well. I think this is important because I think as the years go on, there's already not that many people that work on Spicas and that really know Spicas a lot anymore. And it's let's face it, these guys are retiring or what have you. And at some point, we're just not going to have this knowledge around. And so that kind of concerns me, wanting to keep this GTV for a very, very long time. So we're going to be selling them as a kit, or you'll be able to bring the car to us or ship the car to us, and we're going to install the kits for you. We're going to have dyno numbers off the engine build that we're doing here that I'll show you. And so you'll be able to know exactly if you do these things, 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever, or just install the kit. This is the type of horsepower that you should be able to get from the motor with our fuel injection kit itself. So enough about that. This is not meant to be a sales pitch to you, but just wanted to give you some knowledge as to what we're doing here with this GTV. And this is going to be a one-off car. You're going to see through the whole build. It's going to be spectacular. All right, enough of all that. Let me show you what we've got for the engine rebuild. Again, Paul Spruill, we purchased online Paul Spruill's kit, and then we got the max pitting rods as well to complete the kit. All right, let me show you what we got, and then we'll get started installing or rebuilding the motor. Stay tuned. All righty, guys. So these are the pistons. These are JE pistons, and again, as I showed, they already have the rings. We've got the rings installed, so we're good to go there. As you can see, they're all installed. These are our max pitting rods right here, and these are our new cylinder liners. Now this is an 11-to-1 compression that we purchased from Paul. So we're going to kind of hop up the motor a little bit, make it a little bit more compression to build some more power in it. So Paul's kit comes with the pistons, the rings. It came with the thrust washers, both the new timing belts. This is the lower one already installed. Separately, I bought the fuel pump. This is a high flow fuel pump. It's not like the cheap ones that are out on the market right now. You got your rods and main bearings here. Of course, I've got my new jugs, cylinder walls here. We've got, or cylinder liners, excuse me. And I apologize for the shaking here. I'm holding the camera. We've got the carbs. These are test carbs. We got a windage tray, bunch of gaskets, bunch of nuts and washers, the pins, of course, for the wrist pins itself to lock them in place. We've got the little O-rings and stuff like that. That'll go. Some locking tabs and stuff for the main bearings. Let's see. I got my timing cover done. It's ready to go. So, and then of course, a whole bunch of gaskets and stuff. Rear main seal. The front seal I've already installed, as you can see. So I think that is all to show you on the engine rebuild kit from Paul Sperl. Again, all that came with it except for the high flow oil pump, and then there were some upgrades that we added along the way. And that's really about it. So the block is ready to go. You can see everything's fine. I've already got the rear plate on and sealed down. Apologize for the shaking. I also have the plastic gauge. We're going to test the clearances and everything for the main bearings and the rods itself, especially the rods. With the rods being new, I want to test all that out. These are standard bearings. The crank is there. It's kind of over there. It is fine. It's not in bad shape. It's never been touched. So we should be able to just use the standard bearings with the rods and all that, and we should be good, but we're going to check the clearances. All right, so first step is let's get this thing flipped over, and we're going to get the crank on, and we're going to lock the crank down. We're going to test the clearances, make sure it's fine, and then truly finish that up, and then start working on putting the rods in. So let's get started. Okay, we have the block sitting on top of the bench itself. And our first step is to install the main bearings down on the block itself. The main bearings is where the crank will rest on. And this is important to make sure that we clean all the bearings thoroughly. The last thing we want to see happen is any kind of debris, any kind of metal flakes that we, I guess, can't see with our eyes are left on there. And then when we offer up the crank and start to spin the crank, we end up damaging the crank. So that's one thing that we definitely do not want to do. The second point is to make sure that once you have the bearings installed, that they're lined up perfectly, so the bearings are lined up within the little tang, the marker that they need to sit in to keep them from spinning on you when the crank spins. So it's important to make sure, at least in my opinion, that we have that, have the bearings completely leveled out and in the tang, and that's what you saw with me doing that. So I'm just looking again, making sure the bearings are set properly, and everything's even across the board before offering up the crank. Also making sure that we do have it completely clean. So once we get the bearings installed, then the next step will be to put the crank on, and we'll show that here just in a second. And then once the crank's on, then we're going to test the bearing clearances, and we'll show you how that is done as well. So let's go ahead and offer up the crank and start that process. Okay, so now we're installing the crank to the block. Now, one thing you noticed, we have no assembly lube on these main bearings. I know what you're thinking, Paul, you're crazy, you're going to tear the motor up. We're not rotating the crank yet. Nothing's being done of moving this crank around. Our goal is to get the crank installed. We're going to add the thrust washers, as you can see here. So there's two that go on the bottom, and then there'll be two that'll go on the top on the main cap. Now, once we get the thrust washers installed on the bottom part of the crank itself, that'll just slide right in. Then we're going to put the main bearings on the main caps, and then we're going to go ahead and cinch down the main caps without any assembly lube. The reason why is we've got to test to make sure that our bearing clearances are spot on this motor, and that we don't have any problems with this crank. Now, we've had the crank polished and cleaned and everything's good on it, but we're going to double check it to make sure. So the next step here, once the thrust washers go in, we're going to go ahead and put the plastic gauge on, get the torque settings down on the crank itself, and then check the clearances. All right, so now since we have the crank installed, it's time to use plastic gauge so that we can get a measurement of the bearing clearances for the main bearings itself. Those are the bearings that hold down the crank shaft itself. So here you can see Brad adding the plastic gauge to the top part of the crank itself, and then we'll add the caps. Now, within the caps, we do have the bearings on the bottom side of the caps. That's where it will marry with the crankshaft itself. So you'll see Brad, he's just adding the plastic gauge, and then here I am, I'm putting down the main cap, so that's, we call it number 5. That's at the end or the back of the block. That's basically where we'll be putting the rear main seal, and we'll tap those down with hammers. It'll be the same way for the other main bearing caps itself, and then we'll get into torquing each main cap down to 36 foot-pounds, if I'm not mistaken, and then we'll pull the caps back off and then measure the plastic gauge. All right, so we had a chance to torque everything down, and now we've removed the caps. I spared you the boring details of that. And we're here now measuring the plastic gauge with the piece of paper that has the different sizes. So everything was within spec of each main bearing. So there was no issues with the crank, no issues with the bearings. Everything looked absolutely great. And so this was us just going through, checking, making sure that the clearances were correct. This is so important because if you have slack in the bearings, or they're too tight, you run a risk of spinning the bearings, and then from there it's just, again, it's a complete redo of the motor itself, and we were not interested in doing that. So Brad and I took our time and went through every main and made sure the clearances were correct. So now, since this is done, we're going to remove the crank, and we're going to start applying assembly lube and getting the crank to its final resting spot on the block itself, making sure we're torqued down to the 36 foot-pounds, and move on to installing the pistons and piston liners and checking the bearings as well. All right, now we remove the crank, and we'll inspect the bearings and just make sure everything's okay. We'll clean any residue or any maybe oil from the journals that came out when we were, I guess, after we had torqued down the caps, the main caps. So we're cleaning that up. So once we get all that clean, now we're going to be adding assembly lube, because this is the final resting spot for the crank. So we're finishing up that portion of the build itself, installing the crank and getting the caps and torquing it down for its final resting spot. So we're just kind of cleaning everything up just a little bit, just to make sure everything is perfect. Again, you want to take your time when building an engine. I don't care if it's an Alfa engine or whatever engine you're building, you do want to take your time. It's important. You want to get it right the first time. Again, you don't want to have to pull a motor back out and start over because maybe we were a little careless or wanting to cut a corner here and there. It's just, it's worth spending the time. So we'll clean everything up and then start adding the assembly lube and getting everything installed. All right, so now we're using our Clevite assembly lube. We got this off of Amazon. You can go buy any type of an assembly lube product. It doesn't necessarily matter. I just have always used Clevite through all of my engine builds, and I'm comfortable with them. I know they make a great product. So we decided to continue on with Clevite. Also, Clevite was the makers of the plastic gauge that we used as well. So here you see Brad is just spreading the assembly lube over the bearings, and here I am on the other side doing the same thing. And our goal is to make sure that they're completely covering the whole bearing, because you got to think this crankshaft is going to be spinning really fast, and when you initially crank this motor for the very, very first time, you want to make sure it's fully lubricated before
or while it's waiting on the oil to get through there and do its magic through the oil pump itself, because you're going to have to prime the oil pump to get oil through the journals and get it just running through the whole motor itself. So it's important that you take your time and make sure that you have enough assembly lube sitting on all of the main bearings itself. Oh, and before I forget, do not forget to put the thrust washers in, as you can see that we're working on. Right now, we're putting assembly lube on those as well, and then we're offering those up to the center. So it's the third main cap from the front, and they'll go on there. Now, remember, the thrust washer is to help the movement side to side with the crankshaft itself. So you don't want it to move that way. So you have the thrust washers. So here the thrust washers are at the bottom. And then when we put the cap on, we'll add the other two at the top of the cap. And then that'll form the full circle and for the crank to be able to stay in position backwards and forwards. So do not forget this, or you'll be removing everything to add them back in. All right, now we're installing the crankshaft yet again for its final time. So we're just sitting it in there, make sure it's right. And, pushing down the thrust washers, they'll tend to kind of ride up. They're going to slide, especially with all the assembly lube. So it's just going to be easier just to kind of put them in place, tap them in. You can push on them, but I was just going slow so they didn't shoot out the other side. And once those are in, then we can start to rotate the crankshaft itself. We have the pulley attached to it, make it easier. And you'll see here me rotating it, and it's just buttery smooth, looks great. So now let's go ahead and add the caps on and then get this thing torqued back down for its final resting spot. All right, so we've got the main caps on. We did add assembly lube to the main caps as well, just to make sure we're fully lubed across all of the main bearings. Now, what I'm doing here, we've already torqued the main bearings down. So everything's torqued. So these are basically the locking nuts that the car originally had on there, or the motor originally had on there. So we're tightening these up. We usually go a little bit past hand tight, go past that some. It probably equals about maybe 14 foot-pounds or so. It's not a lot, but these are in just to make sure everything stays or the main nuts are locked down. Now, I'll tell you this, the number 5, you don't use those. You have these little tabs that you bend up and it keeps them from spinning. We also use Loctite, red Loctite on all of them as well. So they were, we torqued them with Loctite, which is basically the oil, and it'll also make sure that nothing will back out in the engine itself and cause some catastrophic failure in the motor itself. So as you can also see is that we're turning it. Everything turns really good. It's super, super smooth. I feel like we've done a great job with checking clearances on the main bearings and getting everything, put together properly with the right torque specs. Again, take your time. Do not rush any of this. It's so important. So next up, we're going to rotate the engine around, and we're going to start to install the cylinder sleeves. And also remember, in the kit or whenever you buy these, you'll have these rubber ring washers, or that'll go in between the block itself and the piston sleeve. And I'll show you that as we start to insert them. But here we're moving the motor back around, facing the right way. And now we're going to start installing the cylinder liners, and then we'll get the pistons in, the rods, of course, and we'll check those for clearances and get everything torqued down. All right, now it's time to install the cylinder liners. Remember to use the rubber O-ring and assembly lube to install them. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Cylinder liners are installed. Let's rotate the block here, and now we're rotating the crank. Everything is running smooth. We're good to go. All right. Unfortunately, the card in the camera got corrupted, so we do not have the video footage of installing the pistons. However, we did get them installed perfectly, as you can see, with the rotation, and the bearing clearances for them were perfect. So we're good to go there. Now we're on to installing the timing chain cover, oil pump, distributor, and oil pan, and then that will complete this episode. So let's get started. All right, so now we're putting the lower timing chain on in the gear. I'm getting that positioned over the crankshaft. There is a key that slots in, so you can't get it, I guess, messed up or backwards or anything like that. So just here wiggling it in, little stretch up to get it into the hole properly. So everything looks good there. And then from here, we'll put the little, this is the warm gear. This gear will be for the oil pump. And so we'll make that up front, and then we'll have the oil slinging disc, or oil slinger, that goes there. So when the cover goes on, it'll keep oil from coming out the front seal that will be on the cover itself. And really, that's about it. We'll go ahead and put the pulley on there, and I'll just kind of rotate it by hand to see everything, to make sure everything is turning properly. And that was me kind of just wiggling everything around, making sure it's in place right. Now the pulley goes on, and then from there we can just kind of turn it and just make sure everything works well. So now let's get on to the next step. All right, so from here, what we're going to do is we're going to put some gasket sealer on. And this is a very, very, very light, very thin coat. So we're not gobbing it on. As you'll see, I'll put a little bit and spread it out as much as possible. Not a whole lot, but just enough to get this thing completely coated. And then from there, we'll go ahead and get the gasket itself on, and then we'll put another thin layer on the timing chain cover, or the front cover as well. Okay, so now we're on the other side, and then we'll just do the exact same thing. We're going to put a very thin layer of this gasket maker on. And again, this is just to help with anything leaking. Um, and I've always used this on these Alpha motors, and it works very well. Again, you do not use a lot. I can't stress that enough. You see how I'm really taking it and getting it very thin around there. Again, we just want to be able to put the gaskets on there, get them to stick well, and then do the same thing on the cover. So we'll get this part finished up, and then we'll be ready for the cover to be mated onto the front of the motor. All right, now we're putting the gasket on, and this gasket will stick with the gasket maker itself. So just here, and you just be real careful. This is a thin gasket, so just take your time. There's no hurry for this. You just got to get it through, get it over the studs, especially the threaded part of the studs, and then it seems to lay in. And then, as you can see, I'm just pressing it down a little bit, just enough just to get it to adhere properly. And then we'll start on the front cover and getting that prepared to be mated to the motor. All right, so there's the cover, and as you can see, we've got the gasket maker on it as well. So now what we're going to do is fit the cover onto the front of the motor. Just take your time. Again, you don't want to mess up the gasket going in or anything. So I've got Brad with me, and we're just taking it slowly, one step at a time, and that's all you need to do. And then get this thing mated, and then move on to the next step. All right, now with the Sproul kit, the engine rebuild kit, it came with all new nuts and everything. So these are the 10 millimeters with the, I call it a flex washer, or whatever you want to call it. So here we're just putting one on the next and the next, and we're getting it tightened down to adhere properly. And then from there, we'll move on and get the water pump on. So this will take just a few minutes. I won't bore you with the details, but as you can see, we're just putting the screws and the washers on the front cover plate. All right, so distributor has been taken out. We just used it to fit everything in properly. So now we got this little special device that we're going to be putting in the place of the distributor. So we're doing a sequential fuel injection system in the car and with all new parts and just to make it more modernized and as well as just to make it more reliable. Now, I know the old school Spica people, guys and gals are going to be like, how dare you do this? And I get it, but I'm building this as a resto mod. I'm building this to utilize the heart of this car, which is this 2-liter motor. So we're going to be putting modernized fuel injection system onto it so that, we will have a little bit more reliable motor, be able to control it with the computer, program it, and get it just right off the dyno. So this is a Hall effect sensor. And basically what this is going to do, kind of call it your cam sensor in a way, but it's not. This is version 1, and this is going to allow us to use this as a top dead center trigger. And then, of course, we'll have the trigger wheel on the car. Instead of the old pulley, we'll put the trigger wheel pulley on, and we'll be able to kind of mate all that together so that we can definitely use sequential fuel injection system, just because we want to try it and we want it to work. Now, version 2 of this is going to be truly putting one in the cam cover on the cam itself, and we're kind of designing the way we're going to do that, and that's going to be another video coming up. All right, and so flipping over the motor, you can tell we've got the bracket on for the trigger wheel, and then the new pulley is on. You can kind of see that my hand's in the way now, but here we're just making sure everything looks good on the oil pump. This is more of a high flow, faster oil pump from Sproul Motorsports. And yeah, so I think the bottom end of this motor is completed. Let's wrap up this video.
This is a wrap on episode 2 for building the bottom end of the 1972 Alfa Romeo GTV. This is the 2-liter Spica motor. Let's go over everything that we've done, just kind of a recap of the whole video and the build series. So I have not put the oil pump on, or I'm sorry, the oil pan on yet. We're going to do that after we get the head on. So next episode we'll get the head on, the oil pan on. We'll start kind of buttoning this up. But let's go over everything that we've done as a recap. So we've got the Paul Sproul, I think it's the Fast Road kit. It's 11-to-1 compression ratio, 85 millimeter, got all new liners, all new pistons. We ended up not using the standard rods that came with the car. We had a problem with, I think it was rod number 4, the bearing for the wrist spin was spinning, and I didn't want to send it off to machine shop, so we went with max speed rods. I think they're like $435 is what I paid for them. It's what you would pay for them. They're not sponsoring the video, but we went with better rods so that way we can get up higher in the RPMs with this build, of course. We've got the lower timing chain in, the timing chain cover on. We've got just a water pump right here. This is the old one. I've got a new one ordered from Alfaholics, but for some reason I think it's held up in customs or something, coming to them before they can ship it to us. I'm not sure, so waiting on that. Let's see what else. We've got the brand new oil pump in. This is from Sproul as well. This is a little faster, higher flow oil pump. We also, one thing to note is when you're putting this on, you're supposed to put the oil pump on and the distributor on together before you mate it to the motor. That way you can make sure that there's no friction, there's no bonding between the oil pump and the distributor. Our distributor looks a little different. We'll talk about that here in a second. So all that was done. Then you put on the cover, but we ended up having to take the pump back off for some reason and put it back on, but we tested everything. So what we did was took the distributor out. I would start to spin it a little bit. I would check to make sure there was some wiggle room by using a screwdriver down the slot, just kind of wiggling the pump a little bit. And I did that all the way around back to top dead center. So from top dead center back to top dead center, every inch I would turn it and test it, turn it and test it. So I feel good about the pump not bonding, nor the distributor not bonding, because that's important, because if you start having one of those start to bind, you can shear the pump. Basically the shaft of the pump will shear off. Don't ask me how I know, but I know from previous builds. So we got that. We've got the new trigger wheel on here, as you can see, and this will help out. Bracket will be here, help count for a fuel injection. Over here, if you notice, I can probably scoot it this way a little bit. So this is not a distributor. This is a Hall effect sensor, and it goes in and mates to the oil pump just like a distributor would. But the beauty of this is we're going to be able to use this in conjunction with the trigger wheel to do sequential fuel injection on the motor itself. So instead of batch, we're going to do sequential. It probably doesn't give us any added event, horsepower or anything, but we want to see if we can do it. Round 2 will be in the head, create a true cam sensor for the head, and then we can take that off and just block it off. But for now, this Hall effect sensor will be the second sensor to use for sequential fuel injection. And let's see what else. I think that's it. The next video or the next episode, we're going to put the head on, the oil pans are going to go on, we'll get a rear main seal on, and then I think at that point we're going to transfer this off this engine stand and put it onto the run stand, and then start working on the intake and the fuel injection for this, which is going to be really, really cool. So we're going to wrap up this episode here. So the next episode is going to be timing the cams on the head outside the car, off the block, and I've got about to work on that video, and once I get that done, I'll release that video as well, and then you'll be able to see how we're changing the timing marks on the cam caps, so that we, because we're going to be putting 11 millimeter cams in the car, both intake and exhaust itself. So I think that's it. So this episode's a wrap. I know y'all been waiting. I know we've had a lot of sneak peek YouTube short videos about it, but we're done now, so we're ready to go. I will get this video edited and out ASAP, and then we'll start working on timing the cams and then getting the head put on block. Okay guys, please like, subscribe, ring the bell, and as always, God bless.